start us off with. It's the end of the semester. I have like 2 weeks to go in my student teaching. And class is over, and I go to talk with my CT. And I ask him a really simple question. When I first walked into your classroom, one word that came to mind when you saw me, talked with me for the first time. Well, he put his feet up on the table, leaned back, thought about this for a minute. And my CT, he was a straight shooter. Whatever came to his mind, he said it. And he said one word: intellectual. When I first walked into his classroom, he met me for the first time. He said, I saw an intellectual in you. And I laughed and I said, you know, you are so right. Because when I first started out, I had this content knowledge. But I really struggled with how to make my knowledge and my passion, give that to my students. How to make this stack of books and old things come alive for students. So, that was my challenge. And also, he reminded me, when I first came in, he asked me my biggest fear. And I remember, my biggest fear when I first started was, I'm afraid I'm going to bore these kids to death. I'm afraid all my knowledge, all my books, everything I know, I'm not going to be able to get up and teach and excite them, engage them, make this classroom a fun place to learn. So he said, we can fix that. And this is the story of how we did. You know, student success for me is really 2 key areas. How do I use this content knowledge that I've spent the past 6 years getting? How do I use that to walk into a classroom and make it a fun place for kids to learn? And 2, what tools do I have available to help me with this? There's a lot of options we can use, but what tool works in the best situations so that my students get the content knowledge, but also want to come to my classroom to learn? So, my CT goes, I've got a lesson for you to teach. A few days after I started, this is the first week and a half I've been teaching. I walk in that morning, 7 a.m., and he goes, I got a lesson for you to teach. Here it is. And I look at it, and it's storytelling. And I freak out, because how the heck am I supposed to tell a story with history? And he sat there and went through with me, and what we came up with, Mr. Person's story. And we walked this character, this little stick figure, through the banking process and the Great Depression. And we told this story about how this little stick figure wanted to buy stock, so he went out and got a loan. And he processed through all this loans, and he bought his stock, and the prices kept going up. He went out and took more loans. But then what happens with the Great Depression? Stock market crashes, and he couldn't repay his loans. And all of a sudden, I was up there teaching this. I started getting into it, you know, like fixing the shirt, sweating a little bit, messing up my hair, getting into the character that was just a stick figure. An exciting lesson that I really didn't know I could teach. Then we ended it. He lost all his money, and then we connected it to the broader Great Depression. You know, there were thousands of these little stick figures, people who couldn't repay their money, and then the stock market crashed. Changes history. Just a little stick figure took something that I was scared to death of and made it alive for my students. I really saw this the next day, because when we walked in, our jump starter for that next day, our students had to retell the story. And I was like, you're not going to be able to retell a stick figure story. What did that mean to them? Get up there and go, retell the story of Mr. Person for me. Every single hand in that room went up. Me, come on, call me. Not once, not twice, but for all 3 of my classes. So a little story, a little change on my part in how I presented my content knowledge. Basis is all there. What I would have told, the facts, the data is all there. It's how I taught them. And how I engaged my students in it that really changed the meaning of history for them. This is another element I designed. Rather than just simply explaining Japanese expansion during World War II, I showed them. I showed them how Japan conquered Manchuria and moved into China. Then I even added resources that they conquered along the way, and how these helped Japan wage war all over the Pacific. And I used sound to engage them. And all of a sudden, I wasn't just designing a simple PowerPoint that had a bunch of words on it that were meaningless to my students. The facts, the data, the content's all there. But who's doing the work putting all this together? Me or my students together? We're working together to build this knowledge, to make it interactive and fun for them. This was one of my favorite designs this semester. I was really big on political cartoons, especially Dr. Seuss cartoons. So as a quick little jump starter, we came up with we would pick a cartoon out that showed some of the content for the day, a review, and we would put a timer on for 3 minutes. And they would have to write down 5 key observations about what they saw. Simple things, just what they were seeing. Any student could do it. Even the ones with my IPs got into this. Really simple. And then we would set the timer again for 1 minute. And then they would have to sit there and they would have to explain what this meant. Quick little writing, 1 sentence. But then they would have to present that to the class. They would have to explain what these cartoons were showing. Again, the content's there. But I'm putting the students to work. They get to process it, learn it, put it together, connect it with everything they're doing. And then they get to show that to everyone else. This was also one of my favorite lessons. We put together these scenarios with placards, and we put the students into groups, and I had them read the scenarios, go through them all, there was about 10, and they had to go through them, pick which superpower it dealt with, USA or the Soviet Union. And then they had to look at their vocabulary that they had spent 2 days working on it. They had to apply the vocabulary and explain to us why. Now, I was dealing with 7th graders, and I'll talk a little bit about writing, but explaining things for 7th graders is not easy. That's a hard detail for them to get. So all of a sudden, they're sitting there and they're talking this out with their group partners, and call us over, and stuff just begins to click for them. All of a sudden, they see why that vocabulary term mattered, how it applied to history. They had to put that with their content knowledge. Then as a class, we went over them together and had them explain why. As groups, what did this mean? What vocabulary turned with it? How did it impact the Cold War? It's not just about the content. It's about taking what they're learning and applying it to actual things. This was also a lesson my CT helped me design. I wanted to do something special for the space race. And I came up, we were talking about student choice and how did we like prediction in the classroom. And I'm a big fan of prediction. So I came up with this space race. Who did it? We went through about 15 of these scenarios together. They saw this image come up with a question. Here's one of them. Who sent the first woman into space? And they had to pick on a prediction card. USA or Soviet Union. And we really got into this lesson. They were raising their hands. Everyone wanted to say USA for the first time. Well, for Space Race First, most all of them are the Soviet Union. They were slamming their hands on the desk going, no! They got into it. The content I loved was there. But it's how I presented it, how I made it engaging, and how I involved my students in the actual learning process that made it meaningful to them. That made Space Race become more than just an open book for them. They got to put their own meaning into it. They got to make it come alive. You know, I found this image when I was browsing through one night at work, and I really thought that this spoke to how I view content. I had the open book, but what I needed and what I needed to learn over these past 2 years was how to make that book come alive for my students, how to make it meaningful to them. And what I tried to do in my classroom with interactive PowerPoints and student choice and vocabulary was to tell students that the history they're studying is about action. It's about personal choices they make in their lives that gets written down in these books. It's about life choices they're going to make. It's about life. What they're learning in my classroom, I want them to be able to take and to apply every day. So, I believe that student success first was determined by how I engaged my students in the classroom. But there was another key element once I achieved that. Once I got them excited about it, once I got their interest, how did I help them grow along the way? Student growth. Well, one key area I think students need to grow in is writing. And if above any other essential skill in my classroom, I hit writing most of all. This was a quick 5 to 10 minute activity I designed called Stop, Think, Write. Halfway through a lecture, random moments, this slide would appear in my lectures. Students knew they had to stop what they're doing and look at me. I gave them a prompt. Usually it was 1 minute. They had to think about a question I asked. I gave them 3 minutes. They had to write nonstop. Do you know what a 7th grader looks at you and says when you tell them you got to write for 3 minutes straight? What? I can't do that. Put the timer on. I get 1 sentence across the paper first time. 3 minutes. Keep writing. I've already said all I can say. I'm done. This is simple. First time, all of them are about a sentence. Well, I keep doing this. And I keep walking around the room. Keep writing. 3 minutes. You gotta keep writing. 3 minutes. By the end of the semester, I'm getting whole paragraphs and students aren't stopping at the 3 minutes. Partly because I had trained them to do this, but also because I gave them the opportunities to express their thoughts. I created a safe environment where they could express these thoughts, share them with the class, which we always did after. These questions were always open-ended. Why questions? Explain. How does this connect? Students, any student could drop in with their comments. Even my students with IEPs, who typically could write no more than a sentence at a time, they may have wrote that sentence down, but when I called on them, they said just as much as every other student, because this mattered to them. They got it, they became involved, and they connected it with what they were learning. DBQs were very important in my school, and I really adopted these papers as my own. I actually did 2 DBQ papers with my students over the course of the semester, just to hit home writing. I spent a total of 4 weeks on 2 DBQ papers. So over a month of my instruction time was spent on the writing process with my students. I found out halfway through from the principal that the 8th graders at my placement struggled with their writing SOLs. So he was really curious how a student teacher was going to run a DBQ essay with 7th graders who were struggling with writing. This was well known in the school. How's a student teacher going to do it? Because my CT, he let me run with this. The DBQs, they were my instructional tool. Well, I said we're going to go back to the very basics of the writing process. I taught my kids how to analyze. I supported their learning while they were doing this. During those 4 weeks, a week and a half was pure grammar. My history classroom became an English classroom. I spent time, I talked with the English teachers at the school. I wanted to know what those kids needed to hit for those 8th grade writing SOLs. That formed the basis of their DBQ assignment. 5 paragraph essays, Do you have a thesis? Do you have evidence? Do you have an argument? Can you support it? I taught my students how to argue. Not only with the think, stop, think, write, but in these papers, they learned how to use evidence, specific pieces of evidence, and link that to their thesis statements. This was a big one for my 7th graders. They learned how to explain themselves. Whenever they wrote in a quick short answer on a test or the DBQ, I would get misplaced pronouns constantly. They would just say, he did this, this happened, and I always circle it what. My students always got papers back from me with circles and what, who, where, when. They hated me for it. But I tell you what, by the end of this, I was getting specific answers on whatever I gave them because they learned how to explain themselves. They learned how to summarize long pieces of data. I had them look at primary sources, maps. They learned how to take these, condense them down into their own words. This was really hard for some of my 7th graders. And I remember one girl in particular, she was having a really bad day. And we went in the computer lab, and she just went in the back, and I just saw her put her head in. And I went over to her after a few minutes, and I started talking with her, and she just started bawling. She said, I cannot do this. So I said, come with me. My CT took over the lab, and I went down to the library with her. And I gave her a minute to look over the packet of information she had. She didn't know how to summarize. She said, I don't know how to do this. So she sat down, read over it for a minute. I timed her with my phone. I took the info away and I put a blinder up here where she was sitting. She didn't know it, but I had a piece of paper and a pen behind the blinder. And I said, just tell me, summarize this information for me. Tell me what happened. 4 key steps. She told me. Then all of a sudden, I lifted up the blinder and I handed her the piece of paper back and I said, this is what you just told me. We went over it and she was like, I did that? I go, yeah, you did. She went back up to the lab. Within 5 minutes, she had done the other 2 summaries she needed to. It clicked for her. The writing process, I think a lot is like building a building. My students, when they first started, they could not even build a strong foundation when they started writing. But after 4 weeks, my CT were talking, and they had erected a superstructure. They had started building their building. And he came to me and he said, you know, these papers aren't really that bad. But he said, they're kind of bland. I said, yeah, they are bland. I said, because over the past 3 weeks, I've been hitting grammar and mechanics so much. I want them to be able to build this superstructure and rebuild it with confidence over and over and over again. Because if my 7th graders leave the classroom after these 4 weeks, after this month of instruction, and they can do that with confidence over and over and over again, then they can learn grammar and mechanics and all these little pieces, how to make their writing better next time. If I leave them with that, I've left them with a huge essential skill that will last them for the rest of their lives. It's about grammar, thesis, writing process, mechanics, how to develop a good conclusion. You know, I was really hard on my students. The first DBQ paper they wrote, this is the average grade I gave my class. I even talked with my CT about this, and I said, we have 2 options. We can be easy on the students and kind of curve the grades, or we can show them what they really got. We showed them what they really got. And I challenged them to do better, gave them the tools to do better, and this is what they did by the second. 2 full letter grades. These papers weren't pretty, but they had the stuff they needed there. That 20% increase I could not be more proud of because they worked hard and they earned it. Another essential skill my teacher and I worked with was life skills. We spent a whole day during the Cold War unit going over personal choices and how they impact you. Do you get out of bed? Do you go to school? How do you behave? How do you follow directions? Do chores? Do homework? How do you respect others? It goes basically to this. This was a sign I had in the classroom. Brian, you probably remember this. Learn to do things on your own. This was my challenge to my students. I wanted them to come to my classroom, and I gave them a creative and engaging space, but they had to learn how to do things on their own. Learn these skills and how to take them into the world. You see, while the history classroom is about action and choices and life, what it really comes down to, it requires hard work, and it requires an investment on the part of you as the teacher and a part of your students. And what I have learned over these past 2 years is that while this was me to start with, it's not me anymore. Because I have learned to take my content and standards as a small piece of who I am as a teacher. And I have really learned how to use technology to engage my students and how to give them a firm foundation of essential skills. And I've learned that when you do these things, when you invest this much work and effort in your students, they see it, they will give you the same back every single time. Thank you.
In task, your favourite content, your favourite in task that reflects you as a teacher, the one you can take to the stories.
My favorite in task, probably that I've really worked on so much over these past, really this past semester especially, was learner development. How do I really take my knowledge and make it fun for my students while keeping it standards-based and essential skills focused at the same time? You can do this a lot with technology and learning how to use it, but really you have to keep the content essential at the core of your instruction, and then you have to really get to know how to the students. What are their strengths, weaknesses, and how do you scaffold this over time? I was a big fan, I cannot believe this, but I was a big fan of using pop quizzes during my instruction. Students would walk in, they would see something on the board, quick 5-minute quiz. We would do analysis worksheets together, we would analyze cartoons. We did this every single lesson with them to really focus on learning differences and how to get them to improve. I did open note quizzes as well, and I would always design 2 or 3 different types of the quiz. That way, I could give my students who had IEPs or Section 504 plans, it was a few less questions, but they were the essential questions. And then with the other students, I could give them a little bit longer quiz, really focus on, again, writing responses, short answer, essay responses.
Which NCSS theme do you think you struggled the most with in terms of that?
Struggled the most with would be probably production, distribution, and consumption. One, this took place during war. I taught World War II and the Cold War. So while production and distribution and consumption play a role, they're not as important when it comes to the content standards for those 2 particular units. So I really didn't have a lot of time to spend on this subject. We went over like home front during World War II, and we did spend 2 days on the different economic systems in the United States and the Soviet Union. But I really didn't spend a lot of time going over resource distribution and how stuff is produced and how that impacts. And one other reason was because I decided to spend a month on writing.